Our first reading from the book of Leviticus provides the background for us in coming to a clear understanding of the passage from the Gospel of Mark that we have just heard. Among the ancient Israelites, those afflicted with leprosy, or what in a scientifically unsophisticated society might have been mistakenly thought to be leprosy, but could have been any common skin condition, were made to dwell outside the camp. This, of course, referred to the encampment of the Israelites as they wandered in the desert on their way from captivity in Egypt to the freedom that awaited them in the Promised Land, a journey of some 40 years. To have to dwell outside the camp in the midst of the wilderness without the support of family or friend was as good as being sentenced to death. Furthermore, lepers were shunned not only because their disease was suspected to be contagious, but also because it was believed to be a punishment from God for their moral failings. When lepers were made to call out unclean, unclean, in reference to themselves, in Hebrew that was unkosher, unkosher. In other words, they were forced to identify themselves with animals such as swine. In the days of Jesus, the fate of those suspected of leprosy was obviously no better. For even though the Israelites were now well settled in the Promised Land, lepers were still made to live outside of the towns and villages in deserted places. As St. Mark notes, Jesus was no stranger to those places, for it seems that Jesus himself took refuge there in order to evade the ever-growing and ever more demanding crowd that kept seeking him out. In fact, it would have been very unlikely for Jesus to have encountered a leper at all, unless he was frequenting these places beyond the pale of civilization. Indeed, this passage reveals that Jesus was one who dared to go where others wouldn't think of going, and he had the courage to allow himself to be approached by one considered unapproachable. His compassion led him to accept one considered unacceptable. His mercy moved him to touch one labeled unclean and therefore untouchable. Indeed, in another passage of sacred scripture, we hear that perfect love casts out all fear. And so in this passage from Mark, in Jesus, we see perfect love in action. Certainly it was trendy recently for people to wear little rubber wristbands inscribed WWJD, meaning, what would Jesus do? Yet beyond being trendy, such a question, if asked sincerely, can be profound and maybe even socially risky. Why? Because sadly, in every society and culture, there are groups of people who, because of things like their race, their class, their nationality, their religion, their lifestyle, or even their failings, are in a sense made to dwell outside the camp. That is, they are pushed to the very margins of society, and contact with them is limited or avoided by those who seek to maintain their own acceptance in the mainstream. But when examining what Jesus would do, we need only look to this and many other gospel passages to see that he went to the places where the outcasts lived. He dined with tax collectors and prostitutes. He even conversed with Samaritans. Clearly, Jesus was not afraid to associate with people considered unacceptable by the society of his day. Not only in his words, but especially in his actions, Jesus sought to break down the barriers that excluded people and rather to bridge the divides that they had set up between and among themselves for whatever reason, religious, civil, moral, or social. This is the core of Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom, a kingdom where all human people are worthy of God's mercy and his love. This is without question what Jesus has taught by his words and his actions. So we as his followers today need not wear trendy little wrist bracelets, but we would do well to keep asking ourselves what Jesus himself would do, as a means of avoiding the construction of invisible but impenetrable walls around ourselves, our families, or our communities of faith, walls that protect our comfort within by keeping those whom some may consider unkosher outside. Indeed, if Jesus did not withhold his compassion, his forgiveness, his healing touch from any and all who approached him in faith, then who are we not to do exactly the same? So let us accept the challenge to continue the healing ministry of Jesus even in our own day, not so much by miracles, but by being unafraid of the people whom we find pushed to the margins of society in our own day, recognizing in them the dignity that is theirs, because they too are children of God and loved by him.